Bonjour à tous. It's a great day for me because it was one of my dreams to arrange such a meeting of international organization experts and practitioners, and I just can't believe that it's coming true. And what I was saying, it's especially sort of emotional because you're all more expert than I am on this topic. I'm a dispute settlement expert, but not international organization, although I do treat that in my sort of academic leg. But thank you very, very much for joining us. Today, Makan Makbe will say a few words. Makan is different things in my life, but he was involved when this topic in research started when I was working for Pascal Lamy, and at the time he was my assistant. Now he's my boss. And he's the first one who started looking at actions by IGOs. And then Lamy came and said, what about initiative powers? I had a lot of initiative power in the commission, for instance. Anyway, so Makan will say a few words and then we'll jump into the panel.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Dear colleagues and dear friends. Dear colleagues and dear friends, good afternoon to all. On behalf of the Dean of the Law School, the University of Geneva, and the Department of Public International Law and International Organization, please allow me to welcome you all in Geneva and to welcome you in our beautiful UNIMIGE, which is, as you can imagine, the headquarters of the Faculty of Law of the University of Geneva. The University of Geneva and our faculty are very glad to host the symposium on the evolution of intergovernmental organizations, initiatives, and enhanced responsibilities. This groundbreaking symposium brings together over 35 academics and international civil servants from around 20 countries and involves important IGOs such as the European Union, the Global Alliance for Vaccination and Immunization, the International Labour Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the United Nations Environment Programme, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the World Intellectual Property Organization, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, and last but not least, the World Trade Organization. So as you can see, this is very impressive. During the next 1 day and a half, you will explore and discuss the complexities inherent to the evolution of the internal law of IGOs and identify the principles that may apply across intergovernmental organizations in terms of initiatives and enhance responsibilities. As Gabrielle Marceau was saying a few minutes ago, this symposium is the result of a long-term project. I, of course, remember that we collaborated on the topic of the right of initiatives in 2004 or 2005. I also remember that I was personally acquainted with the right of initiative of international organizations in 2000 when I was working as an external collaborator at the International Labour Office with Loïc Picard. And it was the time when the ILO was actually investigating what would be the power of sanctions of the ILO with respect to forced labor in Myanmar. It is part of a long-term project, but COVID-19 gave a new momentum to this project. I recall that very recently I co-edited a volume with Jean Daspremont entitled Crisis Narratives in International Law. And one of the common narratives that we find in this book is the need for rethinking and reforming international governmental organizations, in particular in times of crisis. So therefore, we can only rejoice ourselves that Gabrielle Marceau is organizing such a stimulating symposium with the crème de la crème, as we would say in French. Over the course of 1 day and a half, and under Chatham House rules, the symposium comprises 4 panels that first aim to evaluate the influence of an IGO's institutional design and regulatory structure on IGO change. Second, unpack the influence stemming from either the secretariat, the membership, or from a combination of both organs on new directions of an IGO. Third, situate initiatives in the overarching legal mandate of an IGO. And fourth, examine the interaction of IGOs with the outside world. So this symposium has been put together, as you know, by Professor Gabriel Marceau, but also by a wonderful team. And I would like, of course, to acknowledge the great work that that team has been conducting and coordinating for several months. Federico Daniele, Rebecca Walker, Ana Balcazar Moreno, and last but not least, André Philippe Welle. Thank you very much, all of you, for all the great work you've been doing with Professor Marceau to make this day happening. But of course, this symposium would not take place without the support of great sponsors and the generosity, of course, of the Faculty of Law of the University of Geneva, the Administrative Committee of the University of Geneva, the Swiss National Science Foundation, the Geneva Society of Law and Legislation, and the Center for European Legal Studies, whose director, Professor Christine Cadus, is in the room. So I'm very pleased to now open the symposium with its public keynote panel dedicated to IGO initiatives as a response to crisis and unforeseen needs. As you can see, it's a very distinguished panel that will be moderated by a very distinguished moderator, Mr. Nicola Bonucci. So thank you very much for your attention. And Gabriel, you have the floor.
I'll be brief, just to say that this panel is on YouTube. And we have 2 colleagues, Anna and André Philippe, who take notes of everything in case you decide to go for a book eventually. But besides this panel that is public, all the rest is behind closed door and Chatham House. But today it's public and on YouTube. And there's microphone. Thank you. So Nicola.
Hello, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. I think Gabrielle mentioned this initiative in October of last year. And I said to her, this is a great idea. And she said, you know, I would like to have an event organized end of July, the beginning of August. I said, you're crazy. End of July, beginning of August in Europe? So we settled for end of July because beginning of August, I said, no, listen, there are limits, you know, there are limits to what a European human being can bear. But it's fantastic. It's fantastic to have all you here with us today. And it's fantastic indeed. And congratulations to Gabriele, but also to the whole team. So as Gabriele indicated, this one is the only panel for which you can quote, mention names. And it's also a panel which will be a bit interactive because our first speaker will come from New Zealand, but he was smart enough to stay in New Zealand and not to come here, which is good for climate. I will just to say a few words. I will start with what I was listening to McCann list of all the international organizations that are represented here. And I said to myself, oh, I'm so glad that Fox News is not aware of that. Because this is probably what a certain number of people in a certain number of public opinions, I don't want to sound too dramatic, but have less sympathy for, let's put it this way. I think, you know, I would like to use this 1.5 days to also reflect about that. And reflect on how is it that, in particular in the Western world, I will say, there is this lack of trust or even negative feelings vis-a-vis intergovernmental organizations. And, you know, we're not going clearly to answer to this question in the 1.5 days, but I think, you know, the angle that Gabriel has taken, I find it super interesting because it is an angle which is practical, and at the same time, which raises real issues about what is an international organization, who drives it, what do we mean by public interest, what do we mean by interest of the international organization, who determines what the interest of an international organization is and on what basis. So around this topic, which focuses on the right of initiative, I think there are a lot of different questions. I'm going to introduce all the panelists, and then I will leave it to them because we have a panel which I think is an opening panel which really is stunning. The first one who will be given the floor is Fiti Sinclair, that you see up there. Senior Research Fellow at the Law Faculty at Victoria University in Wellington in New Zealand. Guy is an interesting, has an interesting itinerary, and this is where I'm getting old and I need glasses, because even though I pretend not, because before joining the university, he was a corporate lawyer, and he will focus on the law of, he has been focusing on the law of international organization. His presentation will be the one setting the scene. I'm very glad that he's with us. He will be followed by Anabel González. I don't think she needs a lot of introduction, but still, Deputy Director General of WTO, former Minister of Trade in Costa Rica, one of the most well-recognized experts in global trade. And she will focus her presentation on how the WTO responded to the pandemic. Anabel will be followed by Laurence, Boisson Chazournes, who also, I don't think needs a lot of presentation, professor of University of Geneva since 1999. Before that, working at the World Bank as senior counsel for 4 years. And Laurence, who has this advantage of having an academic, but also having a practitioner experience, will look at, is it really something new that we're talking about, or is it something that always been there, which is IGOs evolved because they are composed of human beings? Yes, believe it or not, we are human beings. And Anabel will be followed by Sean Hagan, former general counsel of the IMF, now professor, can I say it? Yes, professor of practice at Georgetown. And Sean will focus very much on the underlying assumption that, you know, the whole system of post-World War II was based upon, which is political on one side, more technical on the other side, and see how much it is really working. And then we will end up with Anne Trebilcock, former legal advisor at the ILO, and now vice president of the Asian Development Administrative Tribunal. The Asian Development Bank Administrative Tribunal. And Anne will talk about COVID, but we'll also talk about what the ILO did following the Rana Plaza, which is one of those typical unforeseen crises that may lead initiatives as the one that we're going to discuss. Each of them will speak around 7, 8, no more than 10 minutes. And then we will enter into a second phase of the panel, which will be a discussion. I really encourage you to be part of the discussion. And, you know, I have some questions that I'm ready to ask, but the best would be only for me to stay silent from now on, and you ask the question and we enter into a real discussion. So with that, and without further delay, Guy, can you kick off?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much to Gabrielle and Nicola for organizing this symposium, and thank you to everybody who has worked hard behind the scenes in organizing it. I'm very sorry I can't be there with you in person, but it's a pleasure to join you virtually. So the topic of the presentation that I committed to give to Gabrielle is on ideologies of change in IGOs. And I'd like to start by posing some broad questions on this subject. And these are questions which we could only begin to scratch the surface of answering in this session or in the symposium. So what ideas, assumptions, or cognitive framings motivate and guide change in IGOs? Is it possible to identify any common or shared rationalities or narratives or structures of legitimation for IGO change? And how do these kinds of ideological elements connect with the other various factors explored in this symposium? A common response to these kinds of questions among international organizations lawyers, at least, might start with something called functionalism, which is sometimes described as the dominant theory or ideology of international organizations law. So functionalism, as international organizations lawyers understand it, posits that IGOs are created by their member states to carry out specific tasks or functions. And so it is a principal agent theory focusing exclusively on the relationship between states and the IGOs they create. But it also assumes that IGOs are neutral and apolitical and presumptively good insofar as they help states to meet their common needs. Put in these bare terms, however, I don't think functionalism tells us much about how an IGO would respond to crises or unforeseen needs, how it would change. Perhaps all functionalism would tell us is that any such change would likely be motivated by the goal of fulfilling the IGO's overall functions or purposes, and maybe it would need to be authorized by express or implied delegations of powers from the IGO's members. So what does functionalism miss or leave out? And a quick look at the titles of the talks in this symposium will give us some ideas. First, IGOs interact and they change in interacting with other IGOs and with a wide variety of non-state actors, informal international organizations, NGOs, public-private partnerships, networks, markets, and so on. Functionalism's narrow focus on the principal-agent relationship between IGOs and their members therefore excludes much of the complex interacting ecology of global governance today. Second, for the same reason, functionalism in this international organizations law sense doesn't have anything to say about the role of executive heads or the secretariats of IGOs more broadly in leading IGO change. And third, the core tenets of functionalism do not really capture how different modes of authority beyond delegation work together to frame and justify change in IGOs. And in particular, I'm thinking here of things like appeals to moral authority, which include but are not limited to the purposes of IGOs, or the invocation of norms and concepts that run deep in legal culture beyond simply rules, or the different forms of expertise that IGOs embody and draw on. In short, it seems to me that functionalism is really much too thin to serve as an ideology of change in IGOs. And it certainly doesn't reflect much of the texture of the self-understandings or justifications of change in IGOs that we see in practice. As an alternative, I would like to suggest that the ideologies of IGO change can be better understood by analyzing the imaginaries through which IGO change is described and legitimized in practice. So I'm drawing here on the work of the philosopher Charles Taylor, and here I propose to think of imaginaries as the complex common understandings which make IGO change possible in common practices and a widely shared sense of legitimacy. And there are 2 points I'd like to emphasize here. The first is that imaginaries operate in the symbolic realm, as it were. They are expressed in shared narratives and legends and images and metaphors and analogies and so on. And the second point is that this symbolic realm of imaginaries occupies a fluid middle ground between embodied practices and explicit doctrines. So the imaginaries of IGO change can be analyzed in two ways. First, by considering the articulated theories, doctrines, rationalities by which international lawyers and international civil servants justify and seek to legitimize change in IGOs. And second, by examining the practices or the technologies within which IGO change takes shape materially. Let me then outline two imaginaries which I think would give us some better access to the ideologies underpinning change in IGOs. The first is the metaphor of the living constitution. This has a long lineage in IGOs, drawing upon traditions of thought about living constitutions and constitutional growth in domestic legal systems. It can be found, for example, in Albert Thomas's descriptions of the ILO as a really living institution, and his comparison of the ILO's expected evolution to transformations that he saw in the history of the Constitution of France. In merging moral purposes and legal authority with the possibility of adaptation to crises and changing needs, the image of a living constitution helped to explain and legitimize a wide range of institutional innovations in the ILO. In legal practice, this imaginary informed a liberal, progressive, and purposive hermeneutics of the ILO's constituent instruments and a broad view of its competences, both within the International Labour Office and in the jurisprudence of the Permanent Court of International Justice. Later on, institutional adaptations in the United Nations likewise came to be understood as expressions of the UN Charter's nature as a living instrument or a living organism or living constitution. And they were linked with ideas of de facto amendment and the emerging doctrine of implied powers. The second imaginary that I want to mention is captured in the idea of international administration. This can also be traced back at least as far as the interwar period, and it invokes an analogy to the emerging national government bureaucracies of the time. And as such, it carried with it connotations of professionalization and expert authority. IGO change has often been rationalized and justified through a more or less self-consciously administrative mode. One of the most effective deployments of this image was by Dag Hammarskjöld, who explicitly linked constitutional growth in the UN with its dangers of overgrowth or fragmentation to the need for greater integration in the activities of the UN with other IGOs, especially through the exercise of novel forms of international executive authority by the UN Secretary General himself when faced with crises or emergencies such as those in the Suez and the Congo. Hammarskjöld himself has been seen by many as an idealized international civil servant, merging personal virtue, administrative expertise, and legal authority in a way that has proved enduringly attractive. So as this comment suggests, these two imaginaries, the living constitution and international administration, have proved highly adaptable to different circumstances and epochs. Both had close affinities at the outset to the rise of the administrative state and the welfare state of the early and mid 20th century in the context of crises like the Great Depression and the two world wars. But then in the post-war period of decolonization, both imaginaries aligned well with the modernization narrative, which legitimized IGOs expanding activities in newly independent states. And their legacies have continued also in the eras of the Washington Consensus, as we say, or the post-Washington Consensus. For example, elements of the constitutional growth metaphor can be found in the writings of Ibrahim Shihata on the dynamic evolution of international organizations. Constitutional imaginaries have been elaborated further in accounts of global constitutionalism and the constitutionalization of international law. And ideas of international administration lie at the heart of new imaginaries like global administrative law, global experimental governance, global governance networks, orchestration by IGOs, and more. Of course, living constitution and international administration are not the only two imaginaries of IGO change that one could explore. They might not even be the most important or the most widespread. But I would like to close by suggesting that we need to be more attentive to the stories we tell ourselves, to the metaphors we live by, and the images that we internalize in thinking about and acting out change in IGOs. And so I'll end with a few more questions. What work do our imaginaries do in legitimizing change in IGOs? how do they relate to our explicit theories and embodied practices of change in IGOs? Do they offer a comforting narrative of progress, the forward march of institutions that continues despite or perhaps because of the crises that punctuated? Do they naturalize and reinforce existing regimes of moral, expert, and legal authority, which may entrench existing inequalities and injustices? Do they encourage us to act as if our moral ends justify our technocratic means? Or could we revisit our imaginaries? Could we reimagine them so as to open up new pathways for change in IGOs that lead in different and more emancipatory directions? So thank you again, and I'm really looking forward to the other presentations and the discussion that follows.
Thank you. Thank you, Guy. I think this was a perfect way to introduce indeed the subject you have raised, the various theories that have been advocated and the consequences that they may have in today's operation of institutions. We will now start to Zoom and Anabel, you have the choice, as it should be. Either you take the mic and you stay or you come here. Thank you. Maybe you won't have the choice. I just want to.
All right, hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Gabriel, Nicola, for this invitation. I am delighted to be here. And, Nicola's introduction reminded me of a story of a friend of mine who used to work at the World Trade Organization, at the WTO, he was from a place in mid-America. And he was saying that when he went back first time after being a couple of years abroad, his family organized, his parents organized a gathering of family and friends at their home. And there were a lot of people who were very glad to see him. They hadn't seen him in a while. And, when someone asked, so tell us, what do you do? And he says, well, I work at the World Trade Organization. And that room goes dead silent. And then somebody there's asked and say, what do you mean world, trade, and even worse, organization? So, he says it took him a bit of time to try to convince, the family and friends that this was not an evil place, out there to attack normal people around the world. So this, I think, shows a little bit what Nicola was saying. But on a more optimist note, I think I will, I'll try to organize my remarks about how COVID-19, I think, provided the most severe pandemic that we've had, of course, in a century, provided a bit of a natural experiment to test the response of international organizations to a crisis of massive proportions. And I would like to talk basically about two things. The first one is how the WTO responded to the pandemic. And the second one is whether the WTO's work throughout the pandemic makes the organization more effective in facilitating better trade policy responses in future health crises. So on the first point, the WTO's pandemic-related work, let me start by saying that soon after COVID-19 struck, it became clear that the pandemic would test the ability of the global trading system to deliver medical goods and services swiftly to the people who needed them the most anywhere in the world. Less clear was how governments would react to this test and whether they would respond by erecting barriers and by adopting going alone policies, or by pursuing the type of coordinated trade response that is essential to deal with the global health emergency. So this was the backdrop for the decision by a group of WTO senior staff to create an internal COVID-19 task force in January 2020. The task force, which received the backing from the WTO's head and senior management soon after its creation, is composed of several technical experts that are drawn from across WTO units and divisions. And it has two main functions. First, to coordinate pandemic-related activities across the WTO Secretariat. And second, to present options to senior management on substantive aspects of the Secretariat's response to the pandemic. As an informal, flexible, and bottom-up arrangement, the task force is, within the context of the WTO, an innovative way to respond and adapt to the changing conditions on the ground and to respond quickly and efficiently to the many and varied requests from WTO members for information on pandemic-related trade issues. The work coordinated by the task force comprises three main tracks. First, data and analysis. As early as April 2020, the WTO began issuing information notes on the trade aspects of COVID-19. A total of over 20 information resources have been published on a broad range of pandemic-related trade topics. For example, a detailed inventory of supply chain bottlenecks in essential COVID-19 products, a ready-to-use checklist of trade-related considerations to accelerate the delivery of vaccines, and comprehensive lists of vaccine inputs and their trade classification to support action by trade officials to ease their flow across borders. The WTO Secretariat also intensified its work to collect and facilitate access to relevant trade data. One prominent example is the creation of the WTO IMF Vaccine Trade Tracker, which provides comprehensive data on the supply and trade of COVID-19 vaccines. The second track of the WTO Secretariat pandemic-related work is information sharing. The WTO hosted several information sharing sessions, often in collaboration with the World Health Organization and the World Intellectual Property Organization, and a wide range of other stakeholders. The goal is to share experiences and best practices that could inform the trade policy action of governments during the pandemic. And the third track is monitoring. Since the start of the pandemic in 2020, the monitoring reports that the WTO Secretariat produces twice a year have covered COVID-19 trade-related measures, both trade facilitating measures and also trade restrictive measures. Now, none of this work would have been possible without the strong backing of the WTO Director General, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. The DG played a critically important role, in my view, in giving strategic direction to the WTO's pandemic-related work, raising its profile, and forging new and innovative partnerships. Dr. Ngozi took office as the WTO DG 1 year into the pandemic in March 2021. She brought with her vast experience on health issues, having served as the chair of the board of Gavi, the Global Public-Private Alliance to Increase Vaccine Equity, and as number 2 at the World Bank, among many other roles. So the issue of vaccine equity in particular is one that Dr. Ngozi cares deeply about. So as soon as she assumed the role of Director General, she used every opportunity to remind world leaders about the moral, practical, and economic imperative of vaccinating the world and the key contribution that an open, transparent, and rules-based trading system could make to achieve that goal, all under the mantra that vaccine policy is trade policy. But her role did not stop there. From the get-go, Dr. Ngozi also sought to improve conditions on the ground. So to that end, she used her political clout to convene the CEOs of every leading COVID-19 manufacturer from around the world to a series of dialogues. The goal was to identify and resolve some of the major trade bottlenecks preventing manufacturers from scaling up production and accelerating the distribution of vaccines. All CEOs came to these virtual meetings. The frank, focused, and off-the-record exchanges between the WTO Director General and the CEOs were another major innovation in the work of the WTO during the pandemic. Prior to that, the WTO regularly engaged with the private sector, but normally not with CEOs on a regular basis, and not with a focus of solving specific problems faced by a particular industry, as was the case this time. Now, let me turn now briefly to the second topic I want to talk about, which is the issue of WTO effectiveness in the face of this and future pandemics. And I'll start with a few words about the current pandemic. So most experts agree that the WTO was relatively successful in keeping a lead on the widespread and uncontrolled proliferation of trade restrictions, especially export bans, during the pandemic. Since the start of COVID-19, governments around the world have adopted close to 100 pandemic-related measures that prohibit or restrict exports. Of this, 68 had been rolled back by March 2022, and 32 remain in place according to our latest estimates. Now, though many factors affect decisions to adopt or eliminate export restrictions, the WTO's monitoring and analysis work, along with our engagement with CEOs and senior level trade officials, arguably played an important role in keeping up the pressure on governments to stick to the purportedly temporary nature of their restrictions. And yet, the data also points to areas where the global trading system could have performed better, suggesting that there is a lot of work ahead of us. The distribution of medical goods, vaccines in particular, was highly uneven, and more than 2 years after the pandemic first struck, just 13% of people in low-income countries are fully vaccinated, compared with 74% in high-income countries. So this brings me to the future, and specifically to the question of whether the WTO is a more effective organization today than it was before COVID-19. And following the pandemic, is the WTO in a better position to facilitate more trade cooperation and better trade policies in a future health crisis? And I believe that the answer is yes. And that's largely thanks to the pandemic-related work, which has delivered 3 new tools that could help WTO members make better trade policies next time a pandemic hits. First, the WTO now has a strong empirical and analytical basis to inform trade policy decisions in response to a future pandemic. The data and analytical tools developed by the WTO Secretariat over the past couple of years have helped improve understanding at a very granular level of many key issues related to the role of trade in providing access to critical medical goods and services. Thanks also to this work, we have a much better understanding of such things as the operation of supply chains for essential medical products, the effects of export restrictions on the operation of supply chains, and best practices to accelerate the cross-border delivery of vaccines. Now, importantly, this work that was started by the Secretariat has now been taken up by WTO committees. And one example is the WTO Committee on Market Access, which now has as a standing agenda item the monitoring of export restrictions and trade easing measures related to COVID-19. So I think that this is an interesting sort of development of further institutionalizing the work in this area. A second set of tools available to the WTO are multi-stakeholder partnerships. I've already mentioned the collaboration with the CEOs of vaccine manufacturers, but I think another very important example is the establishment of the Multilateral Leaders Task Force with the heads of the WTO, the IMF, the WHO, and the World Bank in mid-2021. The main goal of the task force is to support low and middle income countries in accessing the instruments that they need to deal with COVID-19 and to mobilize relevant stakeholders and national leaders to remove critical finance and create roadblocks. And a third and final set of tools that I want to highlight resulted from the WTO's 12th Ministerial Conference, which was held here in Geneva last month. At that conference, there were two important pandemic-related outcomes. The first is on intellectual property rights. It's a decision that clarifies the scope and streamlines the procedures that governments have to limit patent rights for COVID-19. This outcome can be integrated into broader strategies to diversify vaccine manufacturing capacity and export vaccines to countries in need. The second is a ministerial declaration whose main thrust is to make access to medical supplies and components more predictable and secure in times of a global health emergency. And this declaration builds on much of the lessons learned from the WTO Secretariat pandemic-related work. So in conclusion, I think that the leadership of the WTO Director General, the work done by the Secretariat and the members throughout the pandemic provides the WTO with new tools that can facilitate trade cooperation, even in these very challenging times, and can help governments design better trade responses in a future global health emergency. But our work is far from over. There is much room to improve how the WTO can help WTO members achieve better trade outcomes in the future. And more creativity and flexibility is needed to help develop the tools to harness trade for global security in the years to come. So here I think the work that the academic community and policy communities can do in terms of helping us think about positive institutional change is going to be very relevant. Thank you very much.
Just moving quickly, but I would like to react to a couple of points that Anabel said. At first, I think we can have a discussion about vaccine policies as trade policy, because I think this is exactly one of the discussions that we should have, which is, can we still have this separation between international organizations in front of global challenges? The second reflection before giving the floor to Laurence is, and it's a bit provocative, Anabel, you may want to think about it. Isn't COVID, in a sense, a sort of easy test to pass because everybody was suffering from COVID? And for me, the real test is maybe what's happening now, where you have an issue which clearly can affect trade, but it's an issue between the members, and there is less of a consensus among the members on how to handle this issue. But leave it to you. And Laurence.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to Gabrielle Massot, my dear colleague, and the dream team who has worked with her for organizing this conference. It's a pleasure to be here and to see so many friends in the room. So I look forward to all the discussions. So I'm going to be first starting with saying that we all know that international organizations are living animals. And there I take the perspective of Aristotle. Aristotle, you know, was very keen on biology, and he was looking at biological processes. And looking at biological processes, he was doing that with collecting data and patterns. And I think that looking at the program of this conference, it's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be collecting data patterns and trying to identify what is at stake with the right of initiative of international organizations. So animals living institutions means that these organizations have always lived, they move, and it's constant. So it's very difficult, in fact, to systematize what they're doing. And I think that's also going to be a point that we will come back to. So now and I, international lawyer, when we try to rationalize this moving of international organizations, we use theories. So the implicit bias theory is one of them. The necessity one is another. The exceptional circumstances is another one. But in fact, when I was preparing this presentation, I was thinking that these theories, most often I use ex post facto. It's when the organization has done something that then you try to legitimize it from a legal viewpoint. The other element I'd like to stress is that international organizations have a huge room for maneuver if there is the political support of the membership. If there is the political support of the membership, or if the political membership is not opposing to a decision. And I think that is important to have in mind, because we might also want to speak about crisis where there is a political stalemate in the organization and nothing can be done. So when you have sort of the political support, the organization is going to be able to refer to its self-appreciation for deciding what to do at a certain point. So those are elements for understanding this room for maneuver. The additional element I would like to add in this short presentation is that for these organizations to take the right initiatives, you need to have the right people at the right place. And I'd like to focus on the people who are going to be in charge of taking the decisions. So we have heard already about this. And I think we will go back to this with Anabel González at the WTO, because you had a conjecture which was positive for having these decisions to be taken. But I think that there is a human face element to this discussion about initiatives that can be taken by international organizations. Today, I'm going to take an example, and I'm going to be focusing, because the theme of this panel is the right of initiative in times of crisis or unforeseen needs. So I'm going to be referring to an example drawn from the World Bank practice, which took place in the 50s, quite a long time ago. And this was the time of the Indian independence. And there was also the partition between Pakistan and India. And at stake in the partition between India and Pakistan, there was a major river, the Indus River Basin. And there was a big dispute which arose because none of the two countries wanted to conclude an agreement to share the waters of this river. So in this context, coming back to the World Bank was trapped in this dispute because it could not finance a project in India because Pakistan would oppose it. It could not finance a project in Pakistan because India would oppose it. In addition, people were saying, if we don't resolve this dispute, there will be a war. There will be a war between these two countries in relation to the management of this river. And here comes the People Matters theme. At that time, at the World Bank, there was a president called Eugene Black, and he took a bold initiative in 1951. He decided to offer his good offices to the two countries. And he said, I'm going to offer my good offices, but I'm going to set my conditions and the process to be followed. So Mr. Black started and gave his political status to the resolution of this crisis. He visited many times the two countries. He met with the two prime ministers. The process was very bumpy. There were stalemates. And at the time of a stalemate, or not an additional stalemate, the president decided that he should put on the table a management plan, which should be the object of a treaty. And in fact, this solution proposed by Mr. Black became the heart of the treaty that was concluded between the two countries. So as we can see, and I'd like to insist on that, there was a personal involvement of the president of the World Bank at that time. He also, in addition to giving the political status to the resolution of this dispute, he also foresaw that there was a need to think about the implementation of the treaty. So there was a major trust fund that was established, and which is still there, and which helps the two countries to resolve the disputes when they have disputes about the Indus water. So if we go back to this initiative, it was initiated in 1950, and the treaty was concluded in September 60. So it took about 10 years to resolve these disputes. But now that you have this treaty, there is a stabilization of the relationships between the two countries with respect to the management of this, of the Indus River basin. And I'd like to stress that because there have been wars between the two countries, 65, 71, 99, but each time the treaty has survived. And an additional point that I would also like to stress is that when the bank proposed this treaty, the bank also accepted to become a party to the treaty. So the bank is a party to some chapters of this treaty. So the bank put itself in the context of this political situation between the two countries. So a few words of thinking about this example. The president of the World Bank offered the good offices of the organization, although there was no mention of good offices in the constitution of the World Bank, and there is still no mention of good offices in the constitution of the World Bank. Then he was able to take courageous decisions at the right times and to put his political status in the context of the negotiations. So that is one thing. The other thing is that the president was not alone. He had a team. And I think it's also very important. I'm speaking of the head of the organization, but it's very important to have also in mind that there are other people working with the head of the organization, which are important for ensuring that these initiatives can be conducted and that bold initiatives can be taken. So with that, we see that it is possible for an international organization to take a courageous decision at a certain time with the right people. And when preparing this presentation, I was thinking of what happened in Istanbul on 22nd July last week. And it seems to me that it's also a very important moment in the history of international organizations, because there too, you had an international organization, the United Nations, who was in the middle of the disputes, an international organization which has not hesitated to sign a treaty to ensure that it would be possible to export cereals from Ukraine. And if you look carefully at the agreements that have been signed in Istanbul, you will see that UNCTAD is party to it, the International Maritime Organization is also party to it, and so on. So, and if you look at the constitutions of these organizations, you will see that there is nothing about that in their own constitutions. That means that it was the right moment of history, but it was also the right people who were there and who wanted this thing to happen. Now, to conclude this focus on people matter, I would also like to stress that to have the right people, how should we do? And it seems to me that when you look at the history of international organizations, we realize that the selection of heads of international organizations was not as politicized as it is today. And it seems to me that the qualities that were thought for people to head international organizations were not the ones that we have today, where they have to be former prime ministers, former head of states, and so on. So it's a question for us too, but if we want the organizations to be able to react in times of crisis, in times of unforeseen needs, should we also be speaking about the selection process of these people? With that, I conclude. Thank you very much.
Now I understand how it works. It took me 10 minutes. Thank you, Laurence. It was fascinating. I was completely unaware of this case of the Indus Basin. And my first reaction was, why the World Bank and why not the UN? Exactly for, but maybe, you know, there are reasons. But on your last point, I'm sure this will be discussed later during the day and tomorrow. I think there is a lot to be said indeed about the selection process of head of IGOs and the fact that it has become much too political. Not to deny that it has never been non-political, but I think we are reaching now. And as you pointed out, it's not only a question of being political, but also the fact that you need to have a certain type of profile. Like if you had been a prime minister, you are better equipped to deal with an international organization that you have not, which I think is an interesting postulate. With that, we move now to Sean, and I don't know, what do you prefer?
I'll speak it. So thank you, Nicola, and I want to start off by thanking the organizers, and particularly Gabrielle for bringing us together, and also to Nicola and Gabrielle for inviting me to be on this panel. They say that the difference between optimists and pessimists is that pessimists have better information. I'm not saying that I have better information, but my talk will be a little bit more pessimistic than the others. I'm going to be looking at the extent to which the traditional architecture that underpins international government organizations is really going to be able to hold in the current environment. So, you know, what is that architecture? You know, the public international law sort of superstructure that was created after the Second World War is a pretty complex one. But my own stylized way of describing it is that it's underpinned by two principles or features. The first is that states agreed to surrender sovereignty not only by incurring treaty obligations, but actually by creating institutions that were subjects of international law that would basically have the power to monitor the performance of those obligations. And a key aspect of that was independence. Now, as all of us who've worked at different international organizations know, the balance between independence and accountability depends on the institution, right? You have certain institutions on one end of the spectrum, maybe the World Bank, the IMF, where the Secretariat really has the power of initiative under the Constitution. And perhaps on the other end, Anabel and I were talking about at the WTO, where it's much more of a member-driven organization. So there's a spectrum there. But nevertheless, the idea was that they had the capacity to act independently of states through various organs, but also through a secretariat. Now, the second aspect of the architecture, and this is the one that's the primary focus for me, is that even though economic and political issues are closely intertwined, in fact, you know, one of the rationales for the creation of the World Bank and the IMF is that it would help basically establish peace. The idea being that the economic nationalism of the 30s had exacerbated the political instability that gave rise to World War II. So there was clearly a close relationship between the two, but nevertheless, the idea was, let's create specialized institutions. So although every institution is charged with enhancing human welfare, each institution would do it within a specific mandate. And in particular, institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and eventually the WTO would basically focus on economic issues and were precluded from using their economic powers to pursue political objectives. So this was the red line, not using economic powers for political objectives. Now, it's really important to be clear. It does not mean that these institutions were insulated from the political process. Not at all. The IMF's advice on economic policies is very politically controversial, whether it's tax policy, monetary policy. You know, the IMF finds itself in the middle of a political debate all the time. WTO trade policies, you know, you just have to look at the US election in 2016. Trade policies are always politically controversial, but an important distinction. These are the political implications of economic policies. They are not political objectives, all right? So there was always this understanding of a distinction. Now, it doesn't mean that the members in these organizations, the members who are represented in the organs of these institutions, did not take political positions. They did. And as I'm sure Nicola and many of you others of you who worked in international organizations are very familiar, one of the challenges for members was they had political objectives, but they had to manage them within institutions where politically objectives were not explicit. And they had to manage that process, and often they had to make important compromises in terms of how far they could get. And in the IMF, I'm thinking about, for example, the IMF's relationship with South Africa during apartheid, with the former Yugoslav republics. And there were always, it was a very complex process, but there were certain guardrails in place. So over time, there were international organizations that came into existence where political objectives became more explicit. A good example of that, of course, and smaller organizations with a more limited membership, a very good example of that is the EBRD. The EBRD, if you look at it, it has an explicit objective of promoting democracy, okay? And the IMF, for example, is precluded as a legal matter from basically using its conditionality to promote democracy. The EBRD is charged with that. Not only can it, it is required to. But you also have other economic organizations that continue to have obligations or codes that were exclusively economic, but where political factors came in. For example, Nicola, the OECD has accession criteria that include explicitly political criteria, for example, support, democratic systems. So clearly this began to happen, but in smaller organizations. The question now is this going to happen in the universal institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO? And the reason I mention that, of course, is that this issue is catalyzed by Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, where shortly after the invasion, the question rose, can we expel Russia from the IMF and the WTO? Well, at least at the IMF, which is where I worked, the answer is clear. You can if they violated any obligation, but not surprisingly, the obligations under the IMF are specific economic obligations. Issues relating to national security or violation of international law were in the domain of the UN. So but of course, and this is one of the questions, could you amend the IMF's Articles of Agreement to allow for this to happen? And one cannot rule out the possibility that there may, in fact, be an initiative to do so, because you can achieve an amendment of the IMF's Articles of Agreement without unanimity. So, and even worse, in my view, would be an interpretation of those obligations in a way that would allow for Russia to be expelled. So, what are the risks of this? Well, the risks of this are this fragmentation being kind of absorbed into these universal institutions, is that they no longer become or are universal institutions. And it's not just that certain individual countries would be kicked out, but as we've seen from UN resolutions, there are a lot of countries who do not want to get involved in this fight, who would not want to see, many developing countries who would not like to see the IMF and the World Bank to become explicitly politicized by having political objectives. So there is a risk of this fragmentation. And what's sad about this is that it's also coming at a time where the universal institutions are already vulnerable. They're all vulnerable in part, as alluded to by Nicola, because they are seen as being the creators and the champions of the globalization rules, which for many advanced economies in the West basically have, in their views, undermined their welfare. And in emerging markets, many of these institutions are criticized because the governance structure does not give them adequate voice. So they're already vulnerable. And I think this is tragic because this is precisely the time where it's clear that we have global problems that need global solutions and that we need to have the machinery of global cooperation, which these institutions were established. I don't think that necessarily I'm not saying it's going to happen. I think that there are people in prominent positions in major shareholder countries who understand the importance of maintaining this insulation, as stylized as it is. So I'm hopeful that this will not come to pass, but I do believe it's a significant risk. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean, to bringing indeed this subject of Russia. We will try not to have one and a half day discussion about this, but it is a fascinating issue indeed. I don't know if you have followed, for example, the discussion within FATF talking about a non-political or what was seen as the mother god of all the technical, even boring organizations, and the discussion that took place. Can you hear me? Yeah. Within the FATF and the decisions that have been taken, I don't really know on which basis those decisions were taken, but they were taken, including, by the way, to the fact that the presidency that should have been Russian is not Russian, which tells also a lot about how you see the role of the head of an international institution. It's not an IGO, but it's an international institution. So we're going now back maybe a few years ago with Anne, but it is indeed a fascinating case, this case of the Rana Plaza and the reaction that this provoked. But I also understand you're going to talk about COVID. You prefer to come to the, okay.
It's on? Yep. Yes, okay, great. Thank you so much to the organizers of this event, and welcome. I'm really happy to be here to talk with all of you later in the discussion. Thinking about crises, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic came to mind and how the International Labour Organization responded. But there is an article about this actually in the International Organization's Law Review, so I won't dwell on it. I'll just say, overall, the organization got pretty good marks, but it still faced some challenges. The ILO acted boldly in some ways and built on its strengths. It mined new data sources and labor market analysis for the ILO monitor. It relied on international labor standards. It built on promoting social dialogue. It found new ways to work. The ILO's global call to action for human-centered recovery that is inclusive, sustainable, and resilient contains some pointers for confronting other crises. This call to action received unanimous support from the ILO's tripartite constituents, the governments, employers, and workers. But let's take a look at, as Nicola mentioned, at two crisis-related developments that might offer some insights for our discussion. One arose out of Bangladesh and the other Ukraine. In 2013, the Rana Plaza building collapsed, leading to over 1,300 deaths and many more injured. One could debate whether this was a crisis
or rather a predictable result of a business model based on artificially cheap clothing, very low wages, and corruption. In any event, it was a disaster that laid bare governance failures in global value chains. As the dust was settling on the building, two big issues emerged. The first, how to compensate the families of the workers who had died and those injured. And second, how to prevent workplace disasters in the future. Both are of keen interest for transnational law. To make a long story short, there are several articles in the International Labor Review and elsewhere. From 2013 to 2020, the time-bound Bangladesh Accord on Fire and Building Safety, and then a transition accord, supported factory safety and remediation, independent inspections and reporting, strengthening of worker voice through training and safety committees, and gender-sensitive complaints mechanisms. Today, there are new national and international arrangements in place that have superseded the accord. For the initial accord, the ILO acted as a convener, a neutral chair, a broker, and an advisor in an innovative exercise of its constitutional mandate. The accord broke new legal ground by creating a binding instrument linking global market access to time-bound improvements at the factory level. A matter that could not be resolved quickly by the Accord's own steering committee could be referred to arbitration, which became legally enforceable in the home state of the brand. In a dispute that was ultimately settled, the Permanent Court of Arbitration confirmed the enforceability of the accord. However, there were concerns about delays, costs, and complicated procedures under UNCITRAL rules. These led to several new legal initiatives. The first was the Hague Rules on Business and Human Rights Arbitration, which was adopted in 2019. It now offers a comprehensive set of procedural rules for arbitrations involving disputes about adverse business-related human rights impacts. A further result was the development of model arbitration clauses for the resolution of disputes under enforceable brand agreements, which was spearheaded by several NGOs and appeared in 2020. Finally, the International Labor Arbitration and Conciliation Rules, which were developed by UNIGE Global Union, deal more specifically with labor-related disputes. These are all new tools that help put flesh on the bones of the right to remedy that is enshrined in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. On the compensation question, a spin-off from the accord, known as the Rana Plaza Arrangement, provided for the setting up of a trust fund fed mainly by voluntary contributions by a wide range of firms. The ILO served as a trustee of the fund, with the arrangement providing a one-stop independent process for determining income replacement. Among our participants, we have Janelle Diller, who was quite closely involved in this development. Basically, both the arrangement and the accord evidenced bold action that really lay outside the immediate comfort zone of the ILO. The result was families which would have received nothing were paid sums that were calculated on the basis of internationally agreed standards. They drew on ILO actuarial expertise in social protection, as well as on local norms. The model has also since been used elsewhere. While neither the accord nor the arrangement escaped criticism, they did have an overall impact that went well beyond the immediate crisis. And importantly, I think, it went beyond the ILO itself. These actions illustrate how bold action, drawing on strengths, can lead to the development of new legal tools. Along with the pandemic, the Rana Plaza experience was probably also in the minds of delegates to the International Labor Conference this past June. They decided to include, quote, a safe and healthy working environment, unquote, among the fundamental principles and rights that are covered by the landmark 1998 ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. This declaration is now widely diffused across a range of other soft and hard law instruments. It paves the way for the more fundamental structural changes that are needed for a fairer globalization. The amendment was led by outgoing Director General Guy Ryder, and the amendment to a well-embedded instrument does entail some risks. We will see over time whether the risk has paid off. There is a brand new UN resolution on the right to a healthy environment that might give some wings to this right to a safe and healthy working environment. This will be obviously primarily in the remit of the newly elected Director General, Gilbert Humbaut. And I think at this point, I'll just turn, given our time constraints, to the next crisis, the war in Ukraine and its repercussions. And I would like to do this not from the focus of the people who are directly suffering or affected, but what the implications might be for international organizations. For example, the ILO participates in the UNHCR Regional Refugee Response Plan, but it is a small player compared to many others. The ILO has identified several focus areas, and two stand out to me as potential platforms for bold action. The first is the prevention of labor exploitation and human trafficking as a form of forced labor. And second, the inclusion of internally displaced persons and refugees in labor markets. Both areas called for partnerships from the global to the local level. Both draw on the strengths of the ILO, its experience in combating forced labor, its foundation in international labor standards, labor inspection, labor law, and creative gathering and analysis of labor market data. In the context of this conflict and its spillover, there is an ILO recommendation that has particular relevance. The ILO recommendation number 205 on employment and decent work for peace and resilience, adopted in 2017, could indeed steer policymakers. It revised an older instrument that had arisen out of the crisis of World War II. The new recommendation contains guiding principles and advice on strategic approaches in areas such as migrants who are affected by crisis situations, refugees and returnees, rights, equality, and non-discrimination, vocational training and guidance, social protection, labor law and labor market information, social dialogue, and importantly, international cooperation. But I have a fear that the Ukrainian crisis may also pose real threats to the effective operation of the organizations themselves. And I don't just mean how to pay the heating or the cooling bill for a large building or how to cope with inflation. My concern lies elsewhere. What the ILO was able to do in the post-Rana Plaza context and in other areas has been paid for in large part by extra budgetary funds from a handful of donors, rather than from its regular budget coming from member states' contributions. In light of time, I'll skip the figures, but it's pretty clear that the Ukrainian crisis has diverted attention from many other pressing issues. Whether organizations like the ILO can continue to enjoy today's level of extra budgetary support is unknown. If this dries up, hard decisions will be needed about priorities and their consequences. When these touch on personnel issues, organizations should consult with staff representatives to find solutions. And any action taken should heed lessons from the decisions of relevant international administrative tribunals. Not doing so could lead to a new internal mini-crisis generated by an organization itself. Finally, over the next day and a half, perhaps we can touch on the existential crises that face the world today, truly coming to grips with climate change, how to reduce the obscene inequalities that threaten democracy, how to harness artificial intelligence for good rather than evil. But I have run out of time, and I'm afraid that we all are. So we need bold action fast.
Thank you, Anne. I will. We now enter in the second part of the discussion, and before giving the floor, a couple of reflections. The first one, I was wondering if, given that we're talking about initiatives and the personalities of the head of the IGOs, if the ILO would have been run by someone else, a former trade union leader like Guy Ryder after Rana Plaza, if the situation or the reaction would have been exactly the same, maybe you have some views on that. And the second reflection is, it seems to me that at the end of the day, when you hear the various experiences, and maybe going back to, I don't know, where is it? Guy introduction. Maybe the principle that has in fact been driving international organizations is I think it was Winston Churchill who said, never let a good crisis to waste. So maybe this is less than functional and implicit and others. Maybe it's a more pragmatic and also opportunistic way to push evolutions that maybe could have or should have happened in any case, like the Rana Plaza. With that, we still have a big half an hour for discussion, and I really would like, Jose, you kick off.
So this has been terrific, and I agree with everything now. So every time that I come to Geneva, which is often thanks to my fondness for fondue, I learn quite a bit. But one of the functions I seem to function sometimes is to bring a US perspective. So in the US right now, you have competing visions of how bad is the existential crisis posed to the UN Charter Order and to international organizations posed by China. And so you have US Secretary of State's Blinken's foreign policy address basically saying that China poses an existential threat to that world order, and that threat is just shown by the without limits announcement of the China-Russia alliance, including with respect to aggression. And on China's side, it recently released at the very highest level a global security initiative where it basically says the same thing about the US. That is that the US is the greatest threat to an existential threat to the UN Charter Order, pointing to the fact that the US has had is responsible for more deaths through more wars. And of course, the Chinese perspective is that the US is not at all a friend of places like the WTO, whereas China is, and that the US is a sometimes friend of the World Health Organization, but sometimes is not, thanks to Trump, and could easily return to that measure. And my own perspective is that this is a potential where we can see a real existential threat if either the US and China makes it so, either through a wrong move with respect to Taiwan or issues in the South China Sea. And that even though US Secretary of State says he does not seek a decoupling of these two great powers, economic and military, that could easily happen. And I'm curious what the panel thinks about the ability of international organizations through its adaptability to survive an existential threat of that kind, if there is that. And I think Professor Hagan's statements suggest that this is a real threat, that is a real decoupling of the world's greatest economies, is a far different type of Cold War than the old one between the US and Russia, which, let's face it, Russia was not a great economic power at the time. And despite nuclear weapons, that wasn't the kind of existential threat, although we often portrayed it as such. So I'm curious, if that is an existential threat, do IOs evolve to cope with it?
Thank you, Jose. I will collect another one or two questions, please. And then I will ask the panelists, whomever is brave enough to respond in particular to Professor Alvarez's question.
Thank you. My name is Henna Gött. I'm with the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action. Thank you all for a very inspiring session. I have a question going out to Guy. First of all, I have to say I share your criticism with functionalism. I think it's very important to point out that functionalism has certain blind spots. But I was wondering if the imaginaries you mentioned are really just alternatives to functionalism, or if we could also think of them as embodiments of functionalist thought. And maybe ask even further, would these imaginaries still work the way they do if we leave functionalism out of the equation, if there wasn't any functionalist background? For example, the imaginary of a living constitution, would that still work if there's not the idea that the IGO has to deliver a certain function, and that function is sort of the aim the constitution is delivering to? And a brief question to Laurence. Laurence, I found it fascinating, this episode of the Indus River Basin Initiative. And I was wondering if it had ever played a role in this episode that there's an explicit prohibition in the bank's articles to engage in political activity. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it works.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for...
No? Yeah, doesn't? Yes.
Oh, now it's better. So in a way, I think thank you so much for this great set of presentations. My question, I think, piggybacks a little bit on Jose's, and I really enjoyed how Professor Hagan spoke very frankly about the current mood, how there is this sense that international organizations or international initiatives have to be criticized. There is a bit of a lack of faith that we observe, and maybe an impatience with what was the traditional way of getting those things done, and values such as independence and division of labor and the such. And I was just wondering whether I can provoke him to elaborate a little bit on why he thinks that we are at this juncture now. So it is a cultural shift. Is it just a political backlash against politics that got a bit deadlocked with the end of the Cold War? I would be just very curious to hear from your experience why you think that has brought us here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we have first, this was a question to the panel. So who is ready to pick up Professor Alvarez's question about China and the US?
Yeah, I'm going to start, and then Sean and the others will say what they think. But I think
remember you're public, huh?
Is it working? Yeah. I think what is interesting today is that yes, there's this big giants who are playing, and the elephants, huh? And the others are just waiting that they're listened to, and their needs are taken to care. And it's quite interesting to see what the Security Council is doing these days. Because in fact, I think there's an agreement between the big powers that business should continue, and they have a mission to fulfill. And even with the discussion about Syria and the access to humanitarian aid, there was an agreement which was reached. So I would be a bit more hopeful about, you know, the feeling by the two giants or the three giants that there is a need for these institutions and they should continue to work. So that would be one answer. And I'm sure that at the World Bank and the IMF, we would have about the same attitude, although there is some political problems. With respect to the example I gave, I took this example because I thought it was interesting that once upon a time, this organization had the head of the office, which was courageous. And I remember, and I have friends in this room, being involved in discussions in the 90s in relation to the Nile. There was a need for having an institution to work and speak with the riparian states and so on. And in fact, at that time, the people at the organization were quite risk adverse. So it seems to me that there is something that has to be said about the culture of the heads of organizations. And so that's one thing. With respect to the constitutions and the banks of the articles of the bank, for me, when we speak of these major initiatives, I think we go without these legal instruments. And I don't really think that we need the legal support as such. Maybe the object and purpose, but if you really want to do it, if you have the political support, you will find the legitimacy for that.
Sean?
So the more general question was, what has brought us to this point? And I tend to agree with Nicola, is that often IGO evolution, IGO policies, IGO change is driven by events. And I think we are in an environment where the political and economic competition has evolved into a polarization and fragmentation at a level of intensity that I think is quite unprecedented in the last 30 or 40 years. And as Jose has said, I mean, China is very much part of that. I mean, in some respects, in the case of Russia, the issues that I discussed were, in some respects, it's cleaner. It's, you know, economic versus national security, right? Violation of international law. In China, the issue is China is also, there is this integration of economic, national security, and political issues in terms of fragmentation, competition, polarization, and alienation in some respects. And this was not always the case. You may remember that, you know, when China, basically, when Beijing took over the representation from Taiwan, basically China has over time become an increasingly active voice of the IMF. And now it's actually in number 3 at the fund, and I think the same as at the bank. The renminbi is part of the special drawing rights. So there's been steps to basically integrate China not only into the international financial system, but to make it give it a leadership role. Now, there has always been issues around China's economic policies. And rivalries, I mean, in particular, I remember a very difficult period in the mid-2000s where China was alleged to be manipulating its currency and therefore undermining the economic interests of a number of countries, including the United States, that had, you know, a significant balance payments deficit, a very difficult period indeed in the fund, but it was managed. And eventually things were resolved. The question we have now is, I think it's gotten to another level. And my fear is that this is getting to the point where we're no longer talking about differences in economic policy, but there's a political dimension as well, and a national security issues that, as you say, is resulting in an economic decoupling. And what impact is this going to have on the ability of the IMF to basically manage cooperation between these two countries? I don't know. I think it's a serious issue.
So before giving the floor, I would like to give the floor to Anabel. I don't know if you want to respond on the question of China, but I would also like you to say a couple of words about, as I said, you are the only panelist who have been a representative of a member state and now works in the senior management of an international organization. I will be interested in hearing your perspective.
So thank you. I just wanted to make a comment to say that I think geopolitics can drive change in international organizations. And at the same time, institutional change can impact geopolitics. So in the case of the WTO has a role to play in managing the spillovers of national policies and managing trade frictions. And it does so through rules, through monitoring, and ultimately through dispute settlement. So I think as a result of these confrontations, but other sort of changes in the geopolitical sphere, one key question that the organization is aiming at sorting out is, are the current rules and mechanisms fit for purpose? And I have to say that in our ministerial declaration, in our 12th ministerial declaration of last month, there is a paragraph where members recognize the need for WTO reform. And they actually commit to begin discussions about WTO reform, including on the important issue of the appellate body in the organization. So to me, this is an interesting development because it shows that there's one step that has been taken, which is members have agreed.
Sorry, the declaration was adopted by consensus, I guess?
Yes, by consensus. So there is a need for WTO reform. Now, of course, what does WTO reform mean? That's a different story, right? I mean, there are many views around this. But this is to say that these are, I think, incremental sort of steps of an international organization that is aiming at adapting to the changing circumstances. Whether it will succeed or not, or how will it get there, I mean, time will tell. But I do think this is an important step. Now, on your question, Nicola, so I think it depends on where you come from. I think if you come from a relatively small country like I do, I'm from Costa Rica, and I think relative small countries are all but probably two. You would want to have international organizations that have a secretariat that is stronger rather than weaker, so that they can perform the role of keeping the big players within, certain boundaries. I guess maybe if you come from a larger player, your role may be different. So from my perspective, as when I was a representative of a member state, I would prefer to have dysfunctional organizations with secretariats that would be able to, take initiative and move things a step forward. Now I'm on the other side and I'm trying to do that, right? So,
so there is some consistency.
Yeah.
I haven't forgot the question for Guy, and I will ask him to maybe conclude. But before that, I would like to go to Anne, and if you could respond to my question. Do you think that the personality of Guerrero played a role on the Rana Plaza?
I think the personality of any director general plays a role, for sure. Interestingly, the newly elected director general was, right now he's the head of IFAD, but before that he was in the ILO and was the deputy director general with responsibility over issues like what happened with Rana Plaza, development cooperation and so forth. But I don't think, if I'm thinking about the other director generals I've known, Juan Samavia, Michel Ancen, Francis Blanchard, I think they would have all done the same thing. It was such a dramatic event. It was so shocking. And it was so revealing of the basic structural issues that the ILO had been talking about for a long time, that it was an opportunity to bring to the fore really critical concerns that the ILO has had. Can I just mention one other thing in relation to the discussion that has been going on around Russia and Ukraine? In March of this year, the ILO governing body adopted a resolution concerning the Russian Federation's aggression against Ukraine from the perspective of the mandate of the International Labour Organization. It was adopted with 42 votes in favor, 2 against, and 8 abstentions. And I'll just cite 2 sections. First, it declares that the continuing aggression against Ukraine by the government of the Russian Federation, aided by the government of Belarus, is grossly incompatible with the aims and purposes of the organization and the principles governing ILO membership. In that regard, I would mention that there is no provision for expelling any member state in the ILO Constitution. But that doesn't mean that nothing could be done, because the governing body also decided to suspend invitations to the Russian Federation, but not Belarus, to attend all discretionary meetings, such as technical meetings and meetings of experts, conferences and seminars, whose composition is set by the governing body. This obviously does not apply to the International Labour Conference, which is the main rulemaking organ of the institution. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. So the question,
I have a question.
Sure.
Thing to what was said before, isn't it? Again, I'm not as expert as you are, but isn't it always based on who the head is? I know the events may provoke, but I was thinking when we read about the World Bank, when they decided to go into environment, and Charles is here, and then they started hiring people in environment, although it may not have been their initial mandate. Isn't it always based? And I think of DG Ngozi. The first day she arrived, she said, you know, trade policies, vaccine policy, move the boat. We started talking, etc. Isn't it always the main criteria or criteria?
So anybody who wants to pick up this question?
No, I mean, I do think that I say, yeah, exactly. I think there are 2 types of leaders. Leaders that drive organizations, and they need a conducive environment. I mean, somebody was mentioning, I mean, you need members not to be completely opposing you. You know, you need to have that conducive environment, but you have leaders that can drive change, and they do so based on their, you know, they bring their own perspectives, and they're leaders that, I don't know if they're leaders, but they are, you know, people who are at the top of international organizations that not necessarily lead. So I would make the difference between, you know, a head of an organization, maybe not that impactful, and then a leader who wants to drive change.
Yeah, I think, you know, I tend to agree with Anabel. We're focusing on situation in which clearly the head has played a role. We could have maybe a conference on all the situation in which the head could have played a role and has not played a role. So I haven't forgotten the question to Guy, so I would like Guy to do, and then I will pick up the second round of questions. Guy, where are you?
Yes, thank you.
Loud?
Can you hear me?
Please appear as God. Here you go.
Thank you. Thank you, Hannah, for the question. So if I understood it correctly, I don't disagree with what you're saying, which is that some elements, at least of functionalism, can be found within these imaginaries, at least the ones that I spent some time sketching. But I guess what I would say is that as a descriptive matter, as an analytical matter, functionalism doesn't take us very far. So functionalism itself is too thin, is too threadbare, really, to capture the kinds of ideologies that drive change in IGOs. So I think, for example, of your own work on interactions among international organizations, very important work, doesn't really fit into the functionalist framework, as I understand it, or Laurence's work on interactions among regional and universal organizations, the same thing. And so there are elements of what I think practical elements that are expressed in the ideologies that underpin IGO change that are not captured in the elements of functionalism. And then functionalism also doesn't capture kind of the deeper cultural drivers. You know, it's a very, you know, sort of bare, thin description.
Thank you. So we will now open a second round. I saw Hassan, I don't know your name, here, there, and and André Philippe, yes, you're up. Can I ask, so I will try to collect those questions and then I will try to have my panelists behaving.
Thank you very much, Nicola, and thank you all these very distinguished panel. I think that you made a very enlightening case for at least the questions that should be asked. And you have given also some directions as to the way forward. The observation that I have regarding all of these organizations that many of us have worked in, or some academics who have studied them, is to me more of an issue of, what do I call it? Whether they still fit the bill in the light of the new circumstances that we have in the world. They were all created after World War II, and they did reflect the balance of power that existed after World War II. It has been over 70 years, and the balance of power that we have in the world today is very different. You take the UN, many have been asking, why should France and Britain, even after Brexit now, why should they have a seat, a permanent seat on the Security Council? These are very important questions. You take the World Bank and the IMF with the system of weighted voting powers. Should it be that way? There are other interests in the world, other voices that are extremely important. Are they heard the same way? We all, for example, adhere to the principles of democracy. Democracy is one man or one woman with one vote. We are not saying in democracy, if you're rich, you have more votes. So these are, to me, questions that are fundamental and that should be asked. And to me, the issue of legitimacy of international organizations in today's world has at its roots the fact that the fundamental paradigms, or to use Guy's word, the imaginaries that were there at their founding have to be questioned. We all know that the League of Nations disappeared when there was a conflict between what it represented and the balance of power and the imaginary of the time. Eventually, after World War II, the UN and all of these organizations came on board. So my question and observation to the panel is just, what do you think of that change? We know as lawyers what change circumstances mean and what should happen. In this area, it is much more complex, but I would like to pose it as an issue. Thanks.
Thank you, Hassan. Very important question. A lot to be said there. Please.
I think this mic is working.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. My name is Margherita Melillo. And I really I was fascinated by the discussion. I wanted to take more and pick a bit more your brains on the role of the heads of secretariat, especially how we select them. So I know that obviously there are some examples of heads of secretariats are really gone in history for how great they were. And I think a lot of political science literature, for example, is Mostafa Tolba from UNEP. and also the former Director General of the WHO, Gro Harlem Brundtland, which is the treaty that I've studied for my PhD. She's also passed history as a very courageous leader that took on very important initiatives. And I think, for example, that's an interesting case because there is a clear counterfactual, which normally you don't have, is that people were trying to have a treaty on tobacco control passed before she arrived. All the conditions were the same. 94, 96 didn't happen. 98, she arrives 2 years and then the negotiations start. So I think, in that case, I've never had the honor of meeting her, but I know some people in this room have. And in this case, was clearly like just a personal commitment, probably personality. But I was wondering what else makes a good head of a secretariat? So I think there is some discussion on, for example, having an internal member as opposed to a political member, right? So I think just a career person as opposed to someone coming from outside that brings a new perspective. And I believe, for example, Laurence Boisson de Chazournes mentioned that today is very politicized. I guess we have the problem of just selecting, well, that's just a personality problem because you go probably for the minimum common denominator, right? The person that makes the most member states. Well, that make the least number of member states unhappy. That's definitely a problem. But I imagine also that can be an element, for example, of nationality. And be it also going to what Anabel González was saying. There are some people coming from certain backgrounds, certain states who definitely feel more have a stronger background to take the initiatives as opposed to others. Sorry, I like it. But yeah, just wanted to pick more on the experience, obviously, of the members of the panel. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Eric, and then yes. No, you. And
okay, Jos Pauleon of the Graduate Institute here in Geneva. Yes. Anabel mentioned what I think is a very interesting example of how crisis and IO response to crisis can change the operating system of an IO. And I'm thinking of stakeholder engagement. I think I can list 100 reasons why this is great for the WTO to engage with stakeholders. But I was just wondering whether we have a sense of whether member states support this, or whether, as Laurence was saying, if they don't object to it, it's fine. We don't even have to think about legal grounds of doing it. So first of all, do you sense that this is a new trend? I mean, the environmental imperative, I think in some of the other initiatives, the same is happening. And believe it or not, for the WTO, this is a big, big deal. And then secondly, if it's happening, and just to avoid other crises or things going really badly wrong, is the WTO thinking of some rules or procedures to think about whom to invite? You mentioned CEOs were invited, but what about NGOs? Are they thinking about geographical diversity, ideological diversity? I'm just thinking that many IOs have very detailed rules on how to do this. The WHO has its FENSA, and the WTO there's nothing. And I'm just afraid that if you have nothing, you risk a crisis, and then everything may backfire, and this whole very positive development may not happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Jost. If I can just say that, very detailed rules are not necessarily. I mean, the UN has very detailed rules, and I'm not sure that the UN is the best example in terms of real public consultation with NGOs. Christina, and then the gentleman there. Yes.
Thank you first very much for this session, very interesting session on these very, I would say, inspiring topic. I think, Nicola, you mentioned one topic and we did not yet discuss it. It is about the members. So the difficulties and the issues linked with members in the international organization itself. So mainly the current discussion about Russia and Ukraine. And my question would be for the panelists, what kind of adaptation have been found and put into place in order to tackle this issue without hindering the work of the organization? It would be interesting to listen, of course, to the WTO. We know a bit of it, but not so much outside the organization, the IMF, the World Bank as well, ILO. We heard about the declaration, but what about the working conditions internally in the system?
Thank you. And the last question for this round.
Thank you.
But by the way, just to react, Christina, I think there is a discussion to have also about member. Like if the member was a monolithical member, where we all know that, for example, not necessarily the same administration, part of the administration are represented in different organizations. And sometimes we assume that the member has a unique view about how international organizations behave or should behave. In fact, I can tell you on practice that members are a much more diverse unit than we think. Please.
Yeah, thank you. So I teach courses on global governance. And what's interesting—
So you will be able to teach us what it is.
Yeah. No, that's why I'm here, is to learn. And one of the interesting elements of these courses over time is that if you would have taught them 20 years ago, before we even had a term of global governance, it would have been dominated by discussions of international organizations. What I've seen is that actually the amount of material that's now dedicated to international organizations has shrunk considerably, in part because there are all these other alternatives that states and corporations and activists have developed, like public-private partnerships and the like. And one of the fascinating elements about the role of international organizations in terms of actually pushing change is that there's almost always been an attempt by the international organization, whether it's the WTO or UNHCR, to create an alliance, not with member states, but oftentimes with these activists. And sometimes the activists themselves are the initiator of change. So when you mention the greening of the World Bank, you can't tell the story without actually recognizing the role of environmental activists. Or if you talk about the WHO and access to medicines, none of this probably happens without other kinds of transnational actors. And so I'd like you to comment a little bit then on those alliances that, because nothing gets done on your own, right? But the alliances that you create, not only with member states, but with other non-state actors to help move the needle.
So a lot of questions. I hope you took better notice than me. So going back in reverse order, other actors, I think it's a very important topic. Members, as Christina indicated, what does it make to be a good head of international organization you want to apply? The question of Hassan on is the system fit for purpose? And I probably have missed, I think there is a question for Anabel. So let's maybe start with Hassan, who was probably the most existential. And so is the system fit for purpose? Well, if it is today fit for purpose.
So thank you, Hassan, for that question. I think for me, at least, it's helpful to divide your question into kind of two. One is the governance framework. In other words, is the existing system of international organizations appropriate in terms of the decision-making process? And they are indeed, as you pointed out, there is this belief that it is not, especially by low-income and emerging market countries for the reasons you've mentioned. I mean, and I agree with you that a classic example is the permanent 5 veto at the Security Council. But as you know, it also exists at the IMF, or at the World Bank. Although I would point out that at the World Bank, at the IMF, they're not taking on the issue as to whether or not weighted voting should continue to exist. Their belief is that the way the votes are weighted currently are not up to date with the economic clout that these institutions have. All right, so that's one set of issues. But still in the governance area, there is also this issue that's been alluded to, which is IGO is intergovernmental organizations. That was the assumption, is that essentially cooperation would be achieved through hard institutions created by treaties where the exclusive means of communication was between these institutions and governments. Increasingly now, there's this issue of non-state actors. And I think one of the challenges in the decision-making process is how do these international organizations, these IGOs, basically interact with not only non-state actors that are form nationally, but also internationally. These soft institutions that are not hard in the legal sense. And I think that's one of the evolving issues. So I think the first part of your question relates to the decision-making process, but the second part is, are the substantive rules that these institutions oversee, are they fit for purpose? And there, for example, Anabel has mentioned that there is momentum for WTO reform, but when you look at where people are on the substantive rules, like on subsidies, I mean, a huge issue in the trade area is to what extent are the disciplines on subsidies continue to be fit for purpose, right? And so, but I think that's a separate set of issues. And I think whether or not the substantive rules need to be reformed depends on the institution in question. Maybe at the World Bank they do. Maybe concepts of development that the World Bank continues to use are not considered to be currently acceptable. I don't know. My sense is that the bank has evolved, that the substantive rules on development at the bank actually have been modernized significantly. You're in a better position than I am. So, but I would kind of make a distinction between the governance arrangements and the substantive rules that underpin the organization itself.
I'll give the floor to Anabel because she has to leave soon.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So just on your question, I think that engaging the private sector at the level of CEOs in the case of vaccines was relatively easy in the sense that all vaccine manufacturers were engaged. That was the universe, and the universe is relatively limited because there are very few manufacturing companies. Second, the scope was very precise. The objective of the conversation was to identify trade facilitation measures or trade bottlenecks that were impeding manufacturing and distribution of vaccines. And remember that this was at the beginning of vaccine production, where there were, of course, a lot of problems in this regard. And I think that the WTO was effective in addressing some of those challenges and contributed to greater vaccine equity in terms of access. Now, is that an experience that can be replicated in other areas? We did a little bit of that with the discussions on the supply chain disruptions. And we had a couple of meetings, again, with CEOs of logistics companies and transport companies, et cetera. Now, arguably, this is an area where WTO's formal engagement with private sector and other actors is arguably an area where the organization needs to evolve, one of those areas. And in that, when it decides what is the direction to go, then I think your point about having rules of engagement is critical. But I don't think we are there exactly yet, although this is an interesting case that could provide some light on the way forward. Oh, and I'm sorry, I'm going to have to leave Nicola and everyone. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having found the time to come with us. Thank you, Anabel. I would like, before closing, I would like to try to pick up the outstanding question. So Laurence, may I ask you to respond to both the job description that you should offer to anybody who wants to become a head of an international organization? No, you don't want to answer to that? Guy has a question. Okay, and then I forgot the second question I want. Yes, can you maybe also try to address Christina's question on members, and then I will give the floor to Anne, and then we will hear from Guy, and then we'll stop because we're already behind schedule.
I'm not going really to answer because I think I was looking at the program. I mean, I'm an optimistic person, and when you see the wealth of initiatives that have been launched by international organizations, you realize that there is, I think, a faculty for international organizations to adapt and to adjust. Now, there comes the membership, and very often the membership is more conservative than the people working within an international organization. So you need to find the right balance between the political members and the ones who are heading the machine and trying to do as much as they can. And you can speak, for example, of your own organization, the OECD, with the financial crisis. It was just incredible with the reaction of the organization towards, and luckily it had the political support of the states. As I have the—
Not all of them.
But yeah, but you were able to
but
do something.
The balance of power was
Yeah.
tending in clearly in one direction.
I'd like to end, because I have the microphone, with something that, a question I had in mind preparing this presentation is that initiative, we take it as proactive, okay? We think it's something that we do. I think we should also be thinking about the fact that some international organizations have taken initiatives not to do things and to block the system. And I think that is also one of the reasons of the bad functioning of the system. And we can come back to that in the discussion.
Anne?
Thank you. Yeah, interesting comment.
Yeah, and also if you could pick up on the good governance,
Yes.
because your organization clearly is quite unique in terms of incorporating ab initio some of the—
Yeah, exactly. The ILO is composed of member states, classic international organization, but it is not classic when it comes to the internal governance that is then used to move anything ahead. And that goes from the International Labour Conference, its composition, which is tripartite, to the ILO governing body, which is also tripartite. In the ILO constitution as it now stands, there are 10 reserved seats for countries of major industrial importance. In 1986, the organization adopted an amendment to change that. And while it has gained a large number of ratifications, it is not yet enforced, in large part because it doesn't yet have the necessary number of those states of major industrial importance to ratify it. I think it's an example of people being at the table and perhaps not wanting others to come to the table. At the same time, there is repeated criticism of the ILO for not being sufficiently open to other non-governmental organizations beyond those that represent employers and workers. There are some ways in which those organizations can participate through governing body decision, following certain criteria and rules. For example, very often at the International Labour Conference, you have a lot of NGOs pursuing different types of perhaps non-traditional labor or industry issues, and who do, in many cases, influence the debate, but they don't have a vote. To me, it's really, and this is where the academicians among you can answer the question. I really see a dilemma in international law, which still remains a state-based system. How do you have greater participation of legitimate NGOs without basically being bulldozed by hugely financed corporations? I mean, legally, how do you draw those lines? And I hope that some of you in the audience have answers to that.
Guy, I understand you had a question or a comment.
Thank you. I just wanted to maybe respond to a couple of the comments that have been made. One of them from Hassan about whether the system is still fit for purpose, whether we still can work with these existing international organizations in the way they're structured. And I know others in the room will be thinking about the work of Albert Hirschman on voice and exit. And I think that's a useful sort of model to keep in mind. There are efforts to give greater voice to members through, whether it's through trying to reform the veto or weighted voting or those handshake agreements about the executive heads of the international financial institutions. But if those efforts towards greater voice don't yield results, then the likelihood is that there will be some form of exit. Now, often I think that may result in the formation of new international organizations. So more recently, maybe the creation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank or the BRICS Bank might be models of that. But I think that goes back, that sort of story goes back even earlier to, we can think about the creation of regional organizations in the 60s and so on, the creation of UNCTAD. And then it becomes more complicated because exit is not, complete exit. It's usually multiplication and then interaction. So UNCTAD then influences activities within the GATT and so on. The other point I wanted to make was that to pick up on the comments about the role of states and social movements and non-state actors, and to move a little bit away from this, the myth of the great man or the heroic narrative that we sometimes find ourselves telling about the executive heads of international organizations. That's not to say that executive heads don't play an important role, but I think we need to see those other actors in there as well. So a couple of examples. One is from the early ILO, when there was a very charismatic executive head, Albert Thomas. A lot of the mythology of the ILO centers on Thomas and his work, but we should also remember the role of worker representatives of India, for example, that were pushing the ILO to extend its activities into the sort of colonial territories and so on. And then an example from the World Bank, as Laurence knows better than I do, the Robert McNamara in the late 1960s and 1970s did a huge amount to transform the World Bank. But he was, of course, also responding to pressures from below, in a certain sense, from the third world nations that were demanding a different kind of a World Bank, and then later from the new international economic order. And of course, he was also responding to ideas that were coming from other international organizations, like the basic needs idea that was coming from the ILO. So these are not, we should sort of, I think, move away from simple heroic stories and try to see the full ecology of how these international organizations evolve.
Yeah, no, I think you're raising a very valid point, Guy. Let's not, heads of international organizations play a key role, but they are not operating in a vacuum. If you take another example that comes to my mind, which is James Wolfson's speech on corruption in 1996 in the bank. It was bold, but it was not crazy. There was a general discussion. There was a convention of the Organization of American States that was going to be signed or already been signed. There was the general discussion that started at the OECD. So there was a momentum there, and he was smart enough to take this opportunity and to put himself in that momentum. Listen, we're only scratching the surface. We will provide you with a dessert break, and we're a bit late, but stay with us. Thank you very much.